Located on the Macon and Sumter County line in southwest Georgia lies one of the most tragic sites of the American Civil War. It was here on this spot that the Confederate government selected to have a prisoner of war camp built to house Union soldiers moved from other camps in danger of being liberated by Union forces. Officially named Fort Sumter, it would simply become known as Andersonville. Join us as we explore the history and notable locations of the Andersonville National Historic Site, highlighting its establishment, purpose, conditions, as well as its infamous commander, a passionate inmate, a caring Southern priest, and its most notorious group of inmates, the Andersonville Raiders. We will learn why those imprisoned here called Andersonville hell upon earth. As the Civil War progressed, the prisoner population grew for both the North and South due to the Union stopping the prisoner exchange and parole system and more battles being fought. In the South, the Confederate government had to figure out what to do with the Union captured. They were losing ground to Union forces, and the threat of Richmond, the Confederate capital, being captured was becoming a possibility. In the Richmond area were the overcrowded prison camps of Libby and Belle Island. Food and other resources were strained, and fear of the Union Army liberating these camps and rotating the prisoners back into fighting forces caused the Confederates to seek a remedy for this issue. The solution was to build prison camps further south out of the Union Army's reach and in more self-sustaining areas. Confederate General John Winder was commander of the prisons in Richmond and was given command of all military prisons in Georgia and in Alabama. His son Sidney was tasked with finding a site suitable for a new prison, and Andersonville was selected because of its location near a railroad station, its willing population, and fresh water supply. Construction of Fort Sumter began early January 1864 when local black labor, the enslaved and free, were impressed into service to build the camp, which consisted of 15-foot pine log stockade walls, guard towers called Pigeon Roost, and a trench enclosing the 16.5 acres of land. A small creek, the Stockade Branch, ran through the southern end of the enclosure, which was meant to be the camp's clean water supply. Also built as part of Fort Sumter were small earthwork fortifications at the four corners. These were armed with cannons to fend off any Union cavalry who should happen upon this prison. A star fort was located on a hill just south of the stockade. This was the prison's headquarters and was also armed with 9 small cannon-like guns called 3-inch ordnance rifles. 4 of these were pointed out for the defense of the fort, while the remaining 5 were aimed into the stockade in case of a prisoner uprising. Within the prison walls was a line of flag posts that were flying white flags, which served as range markers for the Star Fort's guns. On February 25, 1864, the first Union prisoners arrived at the camp, unaware of the nightmare that their new home would soon become. With about 400 prisoners arriving daily, this camp that was designed to house only 10,000 soon swelled to a population of over 26,000. Under the command of Confederate Colonel Alexander Persons, Fort Sumter was slipping into disarray. Soon, a man named Henry Wirz was sent to take control of the prison. Captain Wirtz took command and immediately reorganized the camp. He ordered the camp's expansion, growing the camp from its original 16.5 acres to 26.5 acres. A deadline was constructed 19 feet in from the stockade wall. If any prisoner crossed or even touched the deadline, the guards up in the pigeon roost, some as young as 13 years old, would open fire, killing the inmate. Deadly head counts and roll calls were also instituted. Wirtz also used violence and threats to keep order with the prisoners. Though some of the imprisoned could recall some acts of kindness and compassion from Captain Wirtz, all knew of his temper. By August 1864, the population of Fort Sumter reached its apex. Over 33,000 men found themselves in the confines of what could only be described as hell upon earth. Starvation, illness, disease, and the loss of hope soon plagued almost all within the walls of this forsaken plot of land. Illness ran rapid through the open pen. Even though some of the prisoners constructed several types of shelter, it was too little and inadequate. Little shade in the summer heat, no refuge from the rain and or the cold, and no retreat from the swarms of insects. Life was becoming unbearable for those imprisoned and even for some of their captors, for disease knew no sides in this war between the states. The main source of sickness came from what was supposed to be the lifeline of the camp, the clean water supply, the stockade branch. The prison's location was due to this water feature. The plan was to use the upstream part of this small stream for its drinking water and the downstream end as the camp's latrine. Unfortunately, several things doomed this plan. First, upstream from Fort Sumter was a Confederate Army camp who used this small stream in the same way. This meant that the stream's waters were already contaminated by the time it reached the prison. Secondly, the runoff from waste in the camp. Many inmates relieved themselves wherever they could because when you're stricken by illness, you don't always make it to the designated restroom. And the last thing is that the stream would back up due to the stockade walls and debris from the prisoners. Now this would form a disease-plagued swamp. A godsend for the inmates of Fort Sumter was literally a man of God, Father Peter Whelan. A chaplain for the Montgomery Guards of the 1st Georgia Volunteer Regiment, Father Whelan knew what it was like to be a prisoner of war. He was captured at Fort Pulaski in April of 1862 by Union forces, and upon his release from the Union prison, Father Whelan returned to Georgia. In June 1864, Father Whelan arrived at Fort Sumter and stayed until September to minister and aid the sick and the dying prisoners. It was during this time that Fort Sumter saw its highest mortality rate amongst its prisoners. When he left in late September, Father Whelan borrowed $1,600 and bought 10,000 pounds of flour, in which he baked into bread and sent to the prison hospital to be used to feed the prisoners. Another godsend would occur on August 16, 1864, in what most of the prisoners considered a true miracle. A group of Christian prisoners were gathered praying for help to relieve the suffering that the camp was enduring when a fierce thunderstorm formed. These storms were welcomed by the inhabitants of Fort Sumter, for they provided fresh, clean water to drink as they opened their mouths to the sky, as well as relief from the scorching heat. But this day's storm's blessings lasted more than a few hours. Lightning struck not too far away from where the prisoners prayed, opening a spring of fresh water. This spring was, however, in the deadline, but another miracle happened. The Confederate guards first allowed the suffering men to stretch out and gather water, then eventually to create a trench to deliver the saving waters to them. This spring, which still flows to this day, was named Providence Spring, and in 1901 a memorial pavilion was erected by the grateful former prisoners to forever protect this life-saving source of fresh water. If losing hope, starving, suffering in the elements, or dying from sickness wasn't enough, you might find yourself the target of a brutal gang of Union prisoners called the Raiders. This band of criminals brought misery to their fellow captives, robbing new arrivals of anything of value, stealing food from the weak and sick, or committing assault and even murder to achieve their crimes or to simply intimidate their fellow inmates. Nothing was out of bounds for this group. In late June of 1864, the prisoners formed a group called the Regulators to protect themselves from the Raiders. The Regulators approached the Confederate authorities asking that something be done about these criminals. General Winder gave permission to the Regulators to hunt down and arrest the offending perpetrators. Between 75 and 150 men were arrested and temporarily removed from the prison to protect them from retribution from the angry prisoners. A court-martial took place over the first several days of July, and many were found guilty. Most of the guilty soldiers were released back into the camp on July the 9th, but had to run the gauntlet. That meant that these soldiers were forced to run between two lines of prisoners holding sticks and clubs, and as they ran through the gauntlet, the prisoners beat them, and at least one of these men died because of the wounds he received in the beating. The court-martial found 6 men guilty of crimes punishable by hanging, and 2 days later, on July the 11th, Confederate authorities permitted members of the Regulators to gather lumber outside of the prison walls to build gallows for an execution. That afternoon, Captain Worst delivered the ringleaders of the Raiders, Charles Curtis, John Sarsfield, Patrick Delaney, Terry Sullivan, William Collins, and Alvin T. Munn, to the Regulators for their execution. Father Whalen asked for mercy on the behalf of the 6 condemned, but Captain Worst declared that it was not in his power to stop the hanging, and that a just judgment had been rendered by their peers. They were hanged, and in an act of final judgment, buried separately from those in the camp who held on to their honor and sense of duty in the face of despair and cruelty. These prisoners organized and operated for a short period of time, but they are most remembered not by their individual names, but by their deeds. However, for 6, their deaths and burials would become legend and create lessons for future generations about dishonor and justice. Sadly for the men held captive within the dreaded confines of Andersonville, death didn't cease doing its gruesome collection. While the prison was only in operation for 14 months, 12,920 of its 45,000 men who passed through its gates would never see their earthly freedom. Not far from the stockade where these unlucky souls met their end is the location of what is known today as the Andersonville National Cemetery. Days after the prison opened in February of 1864, the burials started. First, they started with those who died in a nearby military prison, then those who died en route to Andersonville. Soon, however, death was coming daily to this horrid place en masse, and the dead were placed shoulder to shoulder in long trenches. On March 1, 1864, a new inmate arrived at the gates and would become the most well-known prisoner of Andersonville. His name was Dorrance Atwater. He was not new to the Confederate P.O.W. system. Captured in July 1863 after the Battle of Gettysburg, Atwater spent time at the Belle Isle military prison where he accepted a parole. Although still a prisoner, he worked as a clerk for an office that was in charge of distributing supplies that were sent to prisoners from charities in the North. Soon, Atwater would find himself serving as a clerk in the prison hospital. In June 1864, he was given the duty of maintaining the death roster for Fort Sumter. He had to keep 2 sets of records of every inmate who perished, one for the Confederate Prison Administration and the other to be turned over to Union officials at the end of the war. Now, believing that the Confederates would never turn over the record, Atwater secretly kept a 3rd copy. When he was transferred from Andersonville in February of 1865, he smuggled out his copy. Now, this list would become instrumental in creating the Andersonville National Cemetery. As the Civil War neared its end, the conditions at Andersonville gradually improved. By April 1865, the war would come to an end, leading to the release of thousands of inmates. Sadly, death had not yet finished his grim work with the men from Andersonville. April 24, 1865, saw some 1,900 ex-prisoners of war from Andersonville, Georgia, and Cahaba, Alabama, crammed onto the steam liner Sultana to bring them back north. The Sultana's boilers exploded a few days later on April the 27th. Men, who were already weakened from their imprisonment, were tossed in or forced to jump into the icy cold waters of the Mississippi River to escape the flames. Many prisoners were seriously burned and injured, and 1,169 of them lost their lives. On May 7, 1865, Captain Henry Worst was arrested at Fort Sumter and was taken to the old Capitol Prison in Washington, D.C. While he admitted that the harsh conditions at Andersonville were true, he claimed that he was merely following orders and that overcrowding and lack of supplies due to the war, as well as poor logistics, led to the horrible treatment received by the Union soldiers held captive under his supervision. Captain Henry Worst was convicted of conspiracy and murder, and he was hanged on November 10, 1865. The history of Andersonville is a grim reminder to the harsh realities of war. Today, the Andersonville National Historic Site stands as a sober memorial to those who suffered and lost their lives within its walls, serving as a lesson on the importance of upholding basic human dignity even in darkest of times. The Andersonville National Historic Site is also home to the National Prisoner of War Museum, which tells the story of prisoners of war throughout American history through its exhibits, collections of artifacts, and documentation of first-hand accounts from those who endured the harsh treatment of our nation's enemies during times of war. To learn more about the American Civil War or Andersonville, stop in at your local public or school library to grab a book on this tragic time in our history. You can also check out the description box below for a link to the Andersonville National Historic Site as well as the National Prisoner of War Museum. And if you ever have the opportunity, I highly recommend and encourage you to visit this hallowed ground. Please share this video and subscribe if you haven't already. From the History and Heritage Explorers, I would like to say thank you, and until next time, keep on exploring. All right, I got my water here from Providence Spring. Let's go ahead and get ready to go and explore the rest of it. Uh-oh. Is that it? It's okay, I'm not drinking that water. I'm drinking some bottled water from the car. Don't drink that water, though.